Televiziunea Română, întâlnirile JTI și Fundația Art Production vă recomandă Garantat 100%.
Salutare, bine v-am regăsit la Garantat 100%. Invitatul nostru s-a născut în 1989. Este fiul unui foarte cunoscut profesor universitar, o somitate a lumii academice din Marea Britanie. Tinerețea invitatului nostru nu îl împiedică deloc să fie deja un cunoscut avocat pledant, dar și un foarte apreciat scriitor, autor al unui bestseller. A studiat istorie și politologie la Universitatea Oxford, unde a absolvit ca șef de promoție. Apoi a făcut studii aprofundate la Universitatea Harvard. A scris pentru The New York Times, pentru The Daily Telegraph și alte mari publicații. Doamnelor și domnilor, e o mare bucurie să-i spunem bun venit la Garantat 100% avocatului și scriitorului Jamie Susskind. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you so much for having me here in Bucharest.
And thank you for the book. I'll say a few words in Romanian about the book.
Please do.
Trebuie să le recomand tuturor celor care ne urmăresc acest volum, Politica viitorului, volumul invitatului nostru, domnul Jamie Susskind, un volum apărut la editura Corint, Politica viitorului, tehnologia digitală și societatea, o carte pe care o recomand din tot sufletul și o să vedeți pe parcursul minutelor în care ne găsim împreună de ce. How will you define future politics? Because I presume you're not referring to the future of Boris Johnson, for example, are you?
No, I'm trying to, I mean, who knows what the future of Boris Johnson is?
That's right.
But I'm trying to look at politics on a wider canvas to ask not just what's happening in the next electoral cycle or even the next economic cycle, but over the course of our life cycle. And in some ways that's harder. You're bound to make a few mistakes along the way. But in some ways it's easier because you can step back and look at the big trends that are changing the way we live.
Some of our viewers could say something like, your guest is very young. Is he aware of what's happening around the world? Is he qualified to talk about such difficult topics? What would you answer?
I'll leave it to them to decide that. But I mean, I'm 30, I don't mind saying that. I am part of the last generation that can remember a time before the internet. Anyone younger than me basically cannot. I'm young enough to want to give it a crack, even if it's a very ambitious project, but hopefully I'm old enough to know what I'm talking about. I mean, the truth is that you have to let your words speak for yourself, and I would hope that someone picking up the book would see that I've thought carefully about it and that I've done my best to draw on all of the wisdom of previous ages and not just the 30 years that I've been on the planet.
Are we aware of the speed we travel towards the future? Do we feel that right now? Are we aware of that?
I don't think we are. And the reason for that is that we, as human beings, we tend to perceive time in a kind of linear fashion, whereas a lot of the technologies that are changing the world are changing at an exponential rate.
Right.
So the change is getting faster with every year that passes, and that's very disorienting. So for the last 50 or 60 years, for instance, computer processing power has been doubling in speed every 2 years. And it's hard to conceptualize that kind of exponential growth, but by the end of an exponential cycle, the growth is so extraordinarily fast that the human mind can barely comprehend it. So there are various psychological barriers which make it hard to understand the speed of the change that we're living through. And, you know, compared to our predecessors on this planet, many human beings left the world, and it was the very similar world to the one they were born into. That's not going to be true of us in the 21st century.
Some people could say that this is a clear and present danger. Would you agree?
Yes, but it's also an opportunity. We have to make sure that the technologies that we are developing and the way we are developing them is done for the benefit of all humankind, not just for the small number of wealthy and powerful individuals who might happen to own and control those technologies at a given time.
Hopefully.
Well, it's more than hope, actually, because it's in our hands. We have chosen so far with these technologies, perhaps for good reason, to allow them to develop according to the commercial logic and the logic of the market, and that's led to extraordinary explosion in innovation and creativity.
Right.
But we shouldn't be surprised that what's good in commercial terms isn't always necessarily what's best in civic terms. That what we like as a consumer may actually be bad for us as a citizen. Just to make that real, to give you an example.
Please do.
On social media, the information that we like to see with our consumer hat on might be what is addictive or scandalous or scintillating. But when we've got our citizen hat on, the information we might want to see is that which is balanced and fair and informative and true. But the model of social media, the commercial business model so far, has been only to present us with the stuff that matches the consumer model and not the citizen model. And I, in my work, I'm trying to help us rebalance that.
Don't you think that the human being would rather prefer to live in a comfortable position and to have some entertainment instead of democracy and civic rights?
Well, democracy and civic rights are what give us the freedom and space to enjoy a stable life of comfort and happiness.
Yep.
I do think in this century you will hear and see people pointing to the Chinese example, just as perhaps at the beginning of the last century they pointed to the Soviet example and say, look, what you can achieve when democracy is put to one side and you have an authoritarian system, a benevolent authoritarian system, as it is sometimes called, that looks after the people. I don't believe it's sustainable. I don't believe it prevents tyranny in the long run. I don't believe it treats us equally. I don't believe it gives us freedom in the long term. So the truth is, to enjoy all the fruits of comfort and leisure and happiness, you need to live in a relatively stable political environment. And if you live under a dictatorship or you live in chaos, you're not going to have a nice life.
How can you define dictatorship if democracy is under continuous scrutiny and definition? And what if, at a certain moment, the definition is that democracy is somebody wiser than you who takes care of you?
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because words like democracy don't have a fixed meaning. And this is one of the things that I talk about in the book.
That's why I'm asking.
You're way ahead of me. The truth is that, you know, democracy, for instance, used to be a term of insult. So it was contrasted with other form of governments. And if you accused someone of being democratic or a system of being democratic, you were saying something bad about it. You were saying that it was mob rule, basically. A lot of what we do in philosophy, and it then trickles through into the public realm more generally, is playing with the meaning of words and trying to distort the meaning of words and give them meanings which suit our purposes. Look what's happened to the term fake news in the last 2 years. It started off as describing something quite recognizable, news, which is in fact not news, but fake. And now it is used as a term of rebuttal by any politician who wants to describe something as being, well, who wants to describe something in a way that deprecates it because they don't like it. So to return to your question, we shouldn't necessarily be wedded to words. Who cares what we call it? We might call it democracy, we might call it something else. But we should be wedded to principles. The principle that the state should treat every citizen with equal respect. The principle that the purpose of politics is to maximize the liberty of the community and to engender aims like social justice. We should never lose sight of those, regardless of the words that we use to describe them.
We'll get back to that. As we know, and as we gradually discovering lots of things about man, all about habits, wishes, ways of perceiving things, the human being becomes a sort of a machine. A predictable one, first of all. A machine able to be programmed, as a matter of fact. What do you say about that? Because you write a lot about that here.
So it certainly turns out that we are perhaps more predictable than we would have thought. And it's funny, when these systems, often called machine learning systems, predict our behavior, they're not necessarily predicting the behavior of you or me, but they are predicting the behavior of people like you,
Right.
people with a bundle of qualities that you have and the bundle of characteristics. You know, your sex, your age, your gender, your sexuality, where you live.
Right.
But also thousands of other things like what you buy, where you go, what you care about. And they create profiles of individuals on the basis of which they can, with increasing accuracy, not perfect accuracy, but with increasing accuracy, predict our behavior. In a sense, that is not a new project. The social scientists from kind of Durkheim onwards have always wondered if there is a inner law that governs human conduct, which could be discovered like the laws of nature. And we're getting closer to realizing that aim, even though I think we'll never reach it. And can we be programmed? Well, programmed is obviously, I hope this translates properly, but when you say that humans are being programmed, you're saying that they are, it's basically an analogy, it's a metaphor.
Yes,
You're saying
okay.
when rules are put into a computer program, we are also taught to behave in a certain way. And I believe that in the world that we're moving into, our behavior is conditioned and programmed in various ways. We're subject to the rules and the technologies are all around us. So when you get into a self-driving car and it won't drive over the speed limit, or it won't park illegally just for a moment, which is what you would have done if you were operating that vehicle yourself, you are subject to those rules. You're also pushed around when people gather data about you and use it to present you with, whether it's a commercial product or a politician, presented in the most favorable light to what someone like you is thought to favor. And we're also programmed when technologies frame our perception of the world. We rely on our news feed or on Google search to present us with information about the world out there. And what we're given is only ever a very small slice of reality.
Right.
And that small slice of reality determines our sense of right and wrong, true or false, what we care about and what we don't even know about. And so through all of those mechanisms, technologies can be used to mold and massage us. It's not an Orwellian vision, I don't think we're there yet, but these are new and interesting techniques.
You said yet.
Well, I think the natural progression of these technologies is towards greater and greater influence over us. That is, in many ways, the reason why they are developed, and they continue to improve. For instance, one of the most rapidly advancing areas in what's called artificial intelligence just now is so-called artificial emotional intelligence. So machines are getting very good at reading human emotions, better often than humans. So the best systems can now tell whether your smile is a real smile or a fake smile better than a human being can. And that's going to enable them to have feedback and affect us in ways that are even more profound than they do just now. So I think, yes, if you project into the future, depending on how we manage and sort these technologies, they could be used as real instruments of control.
What do you mean when you say we?
We, the people. So
do we manage that? Can we manage that?
We have to. So I think there are two big threats with digital technology. One is that it is increasingly monopolized by big private companies, and we become their playthings, as it were. The other, however, is the kind of China risk, where the power of technology is hoovered up by the state and used by the government for surveillance and law enforcement and social engineering. And we, the people, somehow need to find a way to navigate between those two forms of regulation which require transparency and openness and place limits on what may be done with our data that will enable us to remain free in the face of these two jousting powers.
And who owns technology will also own us. That's
Right.
more than clear in your book. I mean, you say the people who own the technology will decide what's permitted and what's not. That's pretty frightening, isn't it?
It's frightening. Yeah, it is pretty frightening. I mean, the reason I hesitate is it can be more or less frightening. So for instance, if the morals that are coded into machines reflect the morals of society as decided through a democratic process, and people are comfortable with them and understand them and agree with them, then great. But if they are the morals of a private company, hidden from view, changeable at any given moment, changing only to serve the benefit of the masters of the technology, that's quite scary. So my whole point in the book is that none of this is inevitable. No future is determined unless we do nothing, because technology is developing according to a certain logic, and it's currently the logic of the market. And I think we need the logic of politics and democracy sometimes instead.
Jamie Susskind, at a certain moment you talk about Lenin and Trotsky. There's that famous saying that was really, really, really famous at a certain time in history, that communism is the Soviet power and electricity.
Yeah.
And the famous saying of Trotsky, who didn't agree, who said, well, the progress of technology is not necessarily an equal fact with the progress of the moral thinking.
Yeah.
What about moral thinking, Jamie Susskind?
There is no reason inherently why moral thinking should be improved by technological progress. That's point number one.
I mean, the fact that I own the very latest technology in my mobile phone, it's a very expensive, a very smart as possible, a very good mobile phone. Is this making me a better person?
Not necessarily. It may in some ways. So, you know, you may choose to have applications that help you be fitter or more nutritious or more in touch with your family or whatever it is you want. But it may not. It may make you distracted. It may make you irritable. It may make you more insular because you only see a very small slice of the world, which the algorithms present to you based on what they think you would find attractive.
Right.
So I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong, apart from the fact that what the principal thing that your phone wants you to do is have it in your hand, and that will affect the way that you behave around it. But there is no inherent reason to think that just because our machines are improving that our morals will as well. And in fact, one of the things I'm kind of pushing back against in the book is often a kind of engineering Silicon Valley mindset, which reconceptualizes what are often quite moral problems as kind of math or data problems, but they're not. And the language of math or data is often inadequate to describe what you're trying to do. You're not trying to optimize for something. You're trying to make society more equal or more fair. So, you know, there have been a lot of times in the past when people who have invented stuff have believed that their inventions would inherently make the world better. So, for instance, when the radio was invented, it was said that will end war. Because how could there ever be the kinds of confusions between nations which lead to war when the radio existed? Then when the machine gun was invented, it was said, well, this will make war impossible because it would be so foolish to wage war on each other when one or both sides had this awesome weapon. I think the First World War put an end to that claim.
Right.
And
what an end.
Yes, we find all kinds of monstrous things to do with our technologies. And my big worry, my fear, is that our technological progress outstrips our moral progress. And the moral work of rethinking the world is as important, probably more important, than getting faster and better phones and more ubiquitous technology.
It's very interesting and very paradoxical because lots of people along history would look to the future of technology, and lots of them will depict a rather dark, gloomy, frightening picture. But we're speeding towards future with a quite inexplicable enthusiasm. Why is that?
It's because our individual desires to have the latest phone, to have a faster computer, to have a more efficient public service of some kind, those are all legitimate desires. But where they take you as a whole is to a world where there's too much technology and where it's being used overall for the wrong purposes. So I may like the fact that Facebook connects me with people all around the world. And because of that, I accept the fact that Facebook gathers thousands and thousands of bits of data about me and then sells it to third parties. One of the reasons is that people often don't know the consequences of using technology.
Right.
But another is that they don't care. Or at least they consider that the harms are outweighed by the benefits. And that may even be true at an individual level, but at a societal level, it may not be true.
Please define political theory.
Political theory, I guess, is the study of the words and concepts that we use to think about politics. So the study of words like democracy, freedom, justice. And you can do a number of things in political philosophy. You can ask what those words mean. You can argue about what you think they ought to mean. You can conduct historical research about where their meanings have come from. But ultimately, you're looking at the concepts that structure our thinking about politics.
What's the connection in between technology and power, freedom, democracy, social justice? Because at an individual level, you could easily think that there's no connection, that my phone is just my phone and that's all.
Yes, and this is actually one of the gaps that I try to fill with my book, because there's an old view, which is that kind of technology is just technology and it has no effect on us at all. Then there's a kind of middle halfway house where there's literature about how technology affects us as individuals. Does it make you behave better or worse? Does it make you addicted? Does it change your mind? What does it do to children? But too neglected has been the social question of, if you step back, what is the overall consequence of these technologies for us? So I can't answer your question about the effects on power, democracy, freedom, and justice in one answer, because that is the subject of my book. And,
Right.
I try to devote careful attention to these ideas and what they mean. But what I can say is that it is important to ask systemic questions. Not just how does this affect me, but how does this affect us? And often it affects us in different ways from the way it affects me. Something which might make me richer and more comfortable and more powerful may in fact be making society as a whole worse. Take facial recognition technology, for example. It's been a bit of a controversy in the UK about it. You can see how using facial recognition technology on your phone is kind of convenient and maybe even secure. You know, it improves the security of your phone. But that's a very different question from saying, what does it mean now that facial recognition technology is being used in society as a whole? Is it being used in public spaces? Is it being used by private corporations? Who's got databases of people's faces? The questions are never quite as simple as, how does this just affect me?
At a certain moment, I was thinking that one of our viewers now could say something like, that's very interesting, but I don't see any direct connection, first of all, in between politics and technology. And please spare me with that. I mean, if I live okay, if my life is good, why should I care about definitions? Why should I care about theory? Why should I care about projections in the future and defining words? What's in there for me?
Yeah, well, I think my answer to that would be, first of all, read the book, because I'm trying to answer that very argument. Secondly, theory is not an end in itself. I don't argue that it is. In fact, too much of the academic work that's done in this area is kind of self-regarding and is not made for a wide audience, which I think is a problem. I'm never going to apologize for trying to help people to think clearly about the world in which they live. And yes, there may well be people out there who say, I don't care about politics because my life is great. Or, you know, all I want is a nice school for my children, or a private, quiet life, and that's fine. And, you know, democracy probably wouldn't work if everyone cared all the time about all political issues. But I do care about politics. If your viewer cares about politics, then he should or she should care about technology. I think the defining political question of this century will be to ask ourselves, to what extent should our lives be governed by powerful digital systems, and on what terms? And to return to your earlier question about me being so young, it's my generation that's going to have to answer this question. We are the ones who will ultimately be designing these systems, and will be designing the systems of regulation that govern these systems. And we cannot shrink from that. It is the burden that history has placed on us. And if you want to do that stuff properly, you've got to think clearly about it. And I make no apology for that.
Okay, Jamie Susskind, let's stick to the virtual viewer. He or she could say something like, China is a desirable model, as a matter of fact. You live in good social conditions, you have the right to travel, you have access to technology. Yes, you can score some points as a citizen, and you have to gain some points, but it's a challenge. It's a very desirable social model. How would you answer to that?
Well, I think I would answer first of all by saying I'm sure the Chinese system works for some people there. Probably not if you're a Uyghur Muslim, for example, in a concentration camp. You'd probably think, I'd rather I wasn't in this country because it's treating me very badly. Secondly, China is still a country of colossal inequality, notwithstanding its enormous economic growth over the last little while. But thirdly, you know, China is a really interesting example of a country where you have a kind of authoritarian system where it also has its defenders. Mm-hmm. And, you know,
yep.
I'm in Bucharest. I don't need to tell you that there have always been defenders of authoritarian systems, and they have always had some germ of truth in what they say. And that germ of truth is normally to do with criticism of democracy or criticism of unbridled capitalism and the damaging effects that those systems can have as well. So I'm never going to be able to convince your virtual viewer that what we have in the West as opposed to what we have in China is perfect. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's fair to say that people in China are not as free as people in Europe or the United States. I do think it's fair to say that to the extent that they are free, there is a sword often hanging over their head. They're free within very strict and curtailed boundaries. And I think the people of Hong Kong would back me up in that. Mm-hmm. And my own view is that I don't think it's illegitimate for the government of a state to use technology to better administer public life, to use algorithms, to use data, to do the things that a responsible state does and do them better, whether it's the administration of public health, the management of public resources, the governance of public departments, whatever it is. I look forward to a future in which there are other governments that are able to use technology adeptly. But that's a very different thing from a government which uses technology predominantly to amass more power to itself. And I think history has shown us that that is a dangerous pattern and one which tends to get a lot worse before it gets better.
Please help me with that. My virtual viewer is a very stubborn one, and he says, I am fed up with words. I'm fed up with the inflation of words. I don't care about words. I don't care about freedom. I don't care about democracy. Mm-hmm. I care about my comfort. Mm-hmm. What would you answer to that?
Well, caring about democracy is not caring about the word democracy. Caring about freedom is not caring about the word freedom. It doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is whether you live a life of dignity and comfort and safety. And if you want those things, and if you want them to be stable over the course of your life, then a free and democratic society, I believe, is likely to be the one that is most likely to guarantee that, regardless of who you are. You'll never have to be in a special class. You'll never have to be particularly privileged. In a liberal democracy, you will always enjoy a certain standard of treatment, and I think that's valuable. But I'll pick you up on the word inflation of words, because I do think that we have a problem with bullshit and with people who use and abuse words for their own political ends. And let me tell you, good political philosophy is about fighting that, not about encouraging that. It's about being really crisp and careful with the way you use language and saying, well, do you mean democracy or do you mean something else? Do you mean freedom or do you mean something else? It's about recognizing the value of the words that we use so that when we use them, they can have real impact. A lot of politicians and people in public life, I think, abuse words and they cease to have meaning. And that's why you get cynicism of the kind that you're describing now. But again, I make no apology because words are the currency of politics. You can't have politics without language and communication. And therefore, I see our political language as something to be cultivated and cherished, not something to be dismissed.
On the other hand, our stubborn virtual viewer says that politics is very empty in content, as a matter of fact, right now. And he or she could say that politics, in its essence, is bad. What would you answer to that?
I think it's nonsense. I mean, I can't speak for your system here in Romania, but let me tell you that the issues that are being decided in my country just now, whether we stay in the European Union or whether we leave it, for instance, these are not small issues. These will determine the kind of people and the kind of country that we're going to be for the next half century.
Which side are you on?
Well, I voted to remain in the European Union.
Okay.
That doesn't necessarily mean that I support all the efforts to stop us leaving, because I recognise the legitimacy of the vote, but I believe we should have stayed in the European Union. But half of my country folk didn't think that.
Right.
And so, there were some good reasons for that. The truth is that politics is not inherently bad, but more importantly, politics is unavoidable. You might just think of politics as being what happens in Parliament or on the TV or in books. But actually, almost everything in life is political. What happens in your workplace is political. What happens between a husband and a wife can be political if one exerts power over the other. What happens in the streets is political. Politics will always find us.
Because you just watch TV and you say, wow, politics sucks. That's not politics. That's not only politics.
Exactly.
That's not the only way of doing politics.
Yeah.
That's not the only perspective upon politics.
It could also suck a lot more as well, is the truth.
Good. You used a quotation from Ludwig Wittgenstein in your book, which is really fascinating. When you think of the fact that the limits of our language are the limits of our world.
Yeah.
And when we try to look towards the future, how can we portray the future if we don't have the appropriate words?
It's a great question, and one with which I wrestle all the time. I think one of the reasons we find it difficult to think about the future is because even if we could see the future, we wouldn't have the words to describe it. So, for instance, there's a lot of, and I think this is actually a lot of the fault of lawyers, and let me tell you why. Because when new technologies arise, we spend a lot of time trying to shoehorn, trying to push new technologies into old categories. So, for instance, and I don't know if you have the same debate in Romania, there's a great debate in American law about whether Facebook is a publisher. Because if it is a publisher, it attracts certain legal rights and responsibilities, and if it's not, it doesn't. But the obvious answer is the word publisher describes something old. You might be able to adapt the word and change it and stretch it, but also you might just need a new word. You might need to describe Facebook as something else. And the bigger question is not, is it a publisher, but what do we want to do about it? Do we want to treat it with similar rules as if it was a publisher? Do we want to treat it with specific rules that tackle the fact that it is a new and strange form of political power? And you know, I often hear people using sloppy language, saying Google is like a nation state now, or a big tech company is like a public utility. These are all fundamentally analogies. And the reason we use analogies is because we don't have the actual words. And a lot of what I try to do in the book is develop clarity around words so that when people talk about them, they can be precise. And when they speak and think precisely, then I think our solutions are going to be better.
On the other hand, my virtual viewer could say something like this. Your guest is a barrister. He's a lawyer.
Yeah.
Why is he caring about defining words, about paradigms, about trying to look to the future? He's a lawyer.
Well, on a personal level, it's important to stress that this actually isn't a law book at all. This isn't a book about law. And as well as being a lawyer, I'm a political philosopher. And the fact that I am both enables me to say that sometimes lawyers are very useful, but this is a time in our history when we need to not think like lawyers. We need to think like philosophers. So instead of asking, can we describe these new things in terms of the old, we need to ask, what is the best approach to these new things, and how can we get there, rather than seeing if we can just adapt old ideas from the past. Now, I do think lawyers are needed, but we also need bigger ideas and big thinking, which lawyers are not necessarily famous for.
Jamie Susskind, in very practical terms, what can we do, we as citizens, we as human beings? I mean, We are now active spectators. We are the audience of a huge and extraordinary worldwide performance, the biggest show ever seen. Where will this go?
Well, what can we do? I'm afraid there's an unfortunate answer to that, which is you as an individual and me as an individual actually can't do that much. Because if I decide that Facebook is bad and I leave Facebook, Facebook doesn't care. Facebook has more members than Christianity does.
And you desocialize yourself.
Well, exactly, and I suffer all the harms and very few of the benefits. If I decide Google is wrong and I don't like its algorithm, Google doesn't mind because there are 60,000 other people searching it every second. Right. The question is exactly the same question that workers asked in the past when they said, what can I do about an exploitative boss?
Yes.
And the answer is you on your own can do nothing, but you together can do quite a lot. And hence a trade union, for instance. And even further back, when a slave or a subject said, what can I do to reclaim power for myself? The answer was you can actually do very little, but together you might be able to do a lot. And that's where democracy came from.
Some of my friends now, hearing you, will say, that's a communist. What would you answer to that?
I'm a Democrat, so I do believe there is a role for regulation. I do believe there is a role for the state, because the state is the only body in society which can act on behalf of everyone. But as a liberal Democrat, I believe that the role of the state should go no further than absolutely necessary. So just like other industries where the state might step in to shape incentives or discourage certain behavior, I don't see why the tech industry would be any different to that. And in fact, here in Europe, we already recognize that. Look at the GDPR, look at the right to be forgotten.
Yes.
These are laws which we have, which they don't have in the United States, which are designed at a continental level to protect individuals and their rights. And you can disagree with them, and I do in some respects, but the principle is there, that if you gather together, you can create rules that apply to everyone. Now, I think that is going to be the only way in the future. I am very sensitive, though, to the argument that the more power you give the state, the more you edge towards a China or to an authoritarian system of the kind that we would rather have left behind on this continent. And that is always the risk. But if you don't try and make laws and regulations, then the risk on the other side is still there as well, which you have a dictatorship of a kind from private companies who are left to do whatever they like and affect our lives in whatever way they like. And I don't think that is the future that we want, not with how technology is developing as powerfully as it is.
Then how can we act together if we accept the fact that society, let apart society, our group of friends, my group of friends, your group of friends, is far less together than it was some years ago. We are together through social media, through our terminals. We are not together per se.
Yeah.
How can we be together in order to do those things that you were talking about?
The irony there, of course, is that the very technologies that we need to come together for are the ones that may be making it difficult for us to come together. And that's a paradox that I don't think is necessarily an easy one to escape. And I don't shrink from the fact that it's going to be asking a lot of our politics to regulate this kind of stuff. And by the way, a communist system would be nationalizing Google and Facebook. I wish I'd said this to begin with, but a communist system would be nationalizing them.
Yep.
I don't believe we should be doing that. I don't think the state should own these things, but I do think the state has a role in regulating them in the private industry. And I don't disagree with you. And the truth is there are all kinds of roadblocks that make reform really difficult, whether it's the immense lobbying power of large technology companies, whether it's the division of which you speak, which is taking place not just within societies, but also between countries. You know, we're moving away from a paradigm, returning to the Brexit theme, of international cooperation, whereas this is really something that benefits from international cooperation in the field of technology. There are other problems and difficulties as well. The problem that a lot of the smartest minds tend to go to the private sector rather than the public sector. The fact that technology develops a lot faster than laws do. These are all immense challenges. It's really difficult.
Yep.
But just now we're doing nothing. And I believe that we have to try and do something. And I believe, you know, relatively small, sensible steps can be taken to make sure that technology is guided in a more civic path. And I think in this continent, we should be trying to do that.
When you say state, there are lots of philosophers, thinkers, that will tell you right now, at this very moment, that real power is not anymore in the hands of politicians. That real power is in the hands of corporations. That is the place where real power is, as a matter of fact. How can state regulate what the corporations do under those circumstances?
There is some truth to that, though it is, of course, overstated. And often I think there is this illusion, which I think benefits both private companies and governments, this illusion that they are more at war than they are. So, for instance, in the United States, it is unconstitutional for the government to conduct mass surveillance. But it's not unconstitutional for thousands of different companies to gather data, for another company to buy all that data, gather it in one place, and sell it to the US government. So there is a clear synergy between the state and the private companies. That said, at the other end of the spectrum, you have things like the time when the government was demanding the password to unlock the phone of the San Bernardino terrorist, and Apple refused to give it to the government. And that's an example of a tech firm, as it were, standing up to the state. On a day-to-day basis, the relationship between private sector and the state tends to take the form of lobbying of the kind that I described a moment ago. Enormous amounts of money are spent sending people to Washington, D.C. and other capitals to make sure that the perspective of the tech companies is well heard, Brussels too. But the state has faced enormous private interests in the past, like Roosevelt and Wilson did in the early years of the 20th century with the great railroads and the other monopolies. The financial sector has been regulated to a certain extent in circumstances where many people thought it would be impossible, given the clout and the economic power that they held. None of this is easy, but it can and should be done. And by the way, they probably don't mean it, but companies like Facebook now say, regulate us. Stop getting angry at us when we make a decision to ban or censor someone, or not to ban or censor someone. We can't get it right. Regulate
we offer
us.
ourselves to be kept accountable. Yes.
Exactly. I don't know if that is in good faith, because I think many people at Facebook will know that it is a very difficult job to regulate and that the Congress is not on the verge of doing it, but they are saying it. And I do think that since at least 2016, there has been a recognition that the self-regulation model in the tech industry might not be serving us as well as it did. Before then, it was all-powerful titans of the world, couldn't put a foot wrong. And now I think people are recognizing that these are actually normally just a bunch of skinny, quite young dudes who maybe don't know that much about the moral and ethical consequences of their work, despite being brilliant engineers and programmers.
Jamie Susskind, 2 fast questions, 2 fast answers, please. Although they're big questions. As a barrister, what will we come across in terms of law and order when we talk about artificial intelligence, interconnection, and symbiosis between man and machines?
Well, the various legal systems around the world are already using predictive models to decide where police should be put. So models which determine or predict where a crime is likely to be committed, who's likely to commit it, who's likely to be the victim. They're also increasingly used in sentencing as well, and in parole decisions. So predicting the likelihood that a particular person will reoffend based on data that's gathered about them or people like them. I think that's the main next frontier in law and order and its intersection with technology.
And some people say that this future you talk about is very far. They will say, we'll not get to it, so we're safe. What would you say about that?
Just remember that while we perceive time in a linear way, to go back to your first question, technology is speeding up exponentially. Just look back at how far we've come. We've only had smartphones for 10 years. And before that, the internet for a couple of decades. We are right at the beginning of this era of human existence. It would be, I mean, there are 2 points here. One is that, yes, in 100 years, things are going to be very, very, very different. But just think how different things are now from the way they were for our parents, and then think what they might be for our children. And I think you've got to keep an eye on it.
Jamie Susskind, it's been a pleasure to have you as a guest. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you for having me.
Recomand din nou Jamie Susskind, Politica viitorului, tehnologia digitală și societatea, un volum apărut la editura Corint. Le și mulțumesc prietenilor noștri de la editura Corint pentru mijlocirea acestei întâlniri. Recomand cu mare căldură acest volum pentru că, deși e consistent așa, ca dimensiuni, se citește foarte repede, e o lectură ușoară, o lectură fascinantă și odată ce o să începeți să citiți această carte, vă promit, nu o mai lăsați din mâini. Jamie Susskind, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. Again, good luck with what you do.
Thank you very much.
Tuturor celor care sunt alături de Garantat 100%, mulțumim frumos pentru încredere. Ne vedem duminica viitoare. Noapte bună!